We are in the middle of, nearing the end of, the first chapter of the Tanya. And yes, rest assured, some people in this class, there is in fact a second chapter. God willing, we'll be there soon. We've just been learning chapter 1, nice and thorough. Exactly the way I would have liked to have been taught it, let's put it that way, which is the best I can do probably. So far, in the first chapter of Tanya, what we have discussed, what we've been discussing, we had a series of questions, which was quite a long section right at the beginning of the chapter. Questions that we're not going to answer until later chapters of the Tanya about the nature of the Tzaddik, Rasha, and Benoni, the righteous, the wicked, and the intermediate man, all of which will be revealed, and we'll get to all the answers to that much later. But in order to answer those questions, we have to build a whole worldview of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe's whole way of looking at the universe and at human beings and at Jews and at everything that's within the world, and a full picture of what really primarily what the soul is, what the individual self is of a person with all of its faculties and capacities and in its true nature. And by understanding all of these things, we will then be able to answer all of our questions and begin a practical guide to answering the question that was asked of the Alter Rebbe, the implicit question at the beginning of the Tanya, which is, how can I get closer to God, not just in my actions, not just superficially, but in a deep and profound way that I can truly relate to and truly have a connection with God in my Judaism. So in order to answer that, in order to answer that question, first we have to understand that a Jew has two souls. The second soul we haven't got to yet. The second soul is the godly soul, which we're only going to begin discussing in the second chapter. And we'll have a whole nice, long, multiple-month probably chapter to deal with that one. We are in the middle of discussing the first soul, as Tanya calls it, the animal soul, the nefesh bahamis, nefesh chiyunis, nefesh ativis, the animal soul, the vital biological soul, which gives life to the person, the difference between a cadaver, God forbid, and a living human being, and the natural soul, or the soul of nature, as all of these are different names for the same thing, roughly, more or less, the animal soul of the human being, of the Jew. The first soul of the Jew, as we've now explained at great length, is of the klipa and the sitra achra, which means it derives from the shell reality and the other side, which are mystical, Kabbalistic ways of saying their root is in the divine self-concealment. The truth of all things is that there is only one type of existence, and that is godly existence. Existence is not neutral. There is no such thing as being without mentioning God. There is no such thing in the reality, in the world of the Alter Rebbe, in truth. In truth, as the Tanya explains, and as we'll explain much more as we go further and further into the Tanya, God willing, there is no such thing as something existing stam, as we would say in Hebrew. It just exists, right? All existence is divine. All existence derives from and is an expression of what's called the Yesh HaAmiti, the true existence, the true being, which is God. So it's not, as we said in a previous class, it's not as if we're in a fish tank and there's a whole bunch of things in it. There's us, there's God, there's the table, there's the laptop. There is no tank in which God is contained, so to speak. There's things that exist and God is one of them and I am one of them. On the contrary, we start with nothing existing and God creates existence and gives existence to each and everything that exists. The klipa and the sitra achra is God creates a reality that does not know this truth, that is estranged from the fact that all existence is divine existence. So in other words, he creates something that is actually a divine existence, a divine and godly existence which thinks and which deeply and profoundly, it's beyond thinking, which deeply and profoundly at its deepest truth knows itself to be not a divine existence, which God does for reasons known mostly to God. And as we said previously, which we'll discuss in the 36th chapter of Tanya, which every year we get there, God willing, as to why God makes realities that fundamentally are estranged from the truth of their own existence, right? He creates things that by definition cannot know the truth about themselves, right? That are denied from knowing the truth of themselves. This is called a klippa, it's called a shell, right? Just as the banana peel, as we said in our metaphor, the banana peel is created by removing the fruit, the actual flesh of the banana in a sense, because before you remove the edible flesh of the banana, there really is no banana peel, there's just a banana that happens to have a peel layer, right? The banana peel as a separate being, right, is created by removing the flesh of the banana. So too, the klippa, the shell realities only exist because they don't know the truth of their existence. They don't know what they really are, which is just an extension of godliness, the way that a peel is just an extension of the fruit of the banana. There really isn't something truly separate here. There's only an outer layer. There's only an extension of that inner divine truth. But that inner divine truth is hidden. It's like you eat the banana, and now what's left is banana peel. There's a shell reality. And we keep characterizing this spiritual reality, and there's a reason we characterize it this way in this class, because it will help us, as you'll see, going in today's class, will help us understand a bit better moving forward. We keep characterizing the klippa reality as I am, right? The truth is God is. There is no such thing as an I am. Because there is, except if God was saying it, right? But aside from that exceptional case, there is no such thing as I am apart from God. All existence is divine existence. So really there is no, the whole verb to be can only be truthfully be conjugated with God, grammatically speaking, right? In other words, there is no such thing as just to be. There is to be divine. There is to be godly is the truth of everything. So that there could be a separate I, a separate identity, which says I am, as if there is such a thing as neutral being, right? I say I am, the coffee cup says I am, the angel Michael says I am, and God says I am, and it's all the same, right? That is the klippa reality. The klippa reality is there's such a thing as I am. That's what God is creating, so to speak, through self-concealment. That's what he's creating when he creates the shell reality, the klippa, the external appearance of separate existence from God. That is where each and every one of us, who I'm speaking to right now, more or less comes from. That's the root of our being, right? Because we are not born, and really in most of our lives rarely sense that when I say I am, I'm referring to something godly. When I say I am, I sense myself to be referring simply to something that just is, something that's just me. When I say I am, I'm talking about something that I've taken as a given for as long as I existed, right? Which is that I am, right? That vitality, that inner spiritual core, that deepest self of the Jew, at least his deepest self in the first soul. We haven't got to the second half of the story yet. But in the first half of the story, that deepest self is I am. And this spiritual I am is the source of the biological life of the Jew, right? And of all human beings, really, right? The I am is what goes and encloses in the blood, as we've discussed, the lowest level of that spiritual reality, and the highest level and most refined level of the physical flesh and matter of the body are united to create one living human being, right? And that's what we mean when we say that this is the biological vitality of the person, right? What is it that makes me alive, that makes me a person, really, rather than a body? A body's not really a person, by the way. If you want to get philosophically precise, the moment the person passes away, they're no longer here, right? Just because some components still exist doesn't mean that the person is still here, right? That's a different issue. We could go into that more. There's very interesting memorim about the separation of the body and soul, and sort of different things that we see in this reality. But anyway, what unites with the physical body to make it into a person, and that the body itself should be alive in every atom, in every square inch of the body, that it should become a living human being. And truly, a body and a living human being are incomparable. They're really two totally different things, right? The answer is, it's this spiritual I am, right? God makes this divine self-concealment, that there could be a self other than God. And that self then is literally what vivifies and gives vitality to the body, not like the commonly accepted today societal, you could even say scientific view maybe, that life is purely a material process, right? The Torah, of course, rejects this out of hand. In fact, it's explicitly denied in the Torah, because in the Torah we say that Hashem breathes into Adam HaRishon the breath of life, right? Although in Tanya, as we're going to see, we say that refers to the Nefesh Elokis and not the Nefesh HaBahamis. So I don't know how much of it, I don't know if it's really a proof of the point that I'm bringing out. But nevertheless, we absolutely, Judaism is of the opinion, and the truth is that it's a very, very well-founded opinion, rationally and logically, despite how little airtime it gets nowadays. Just a discussion for a different time, and why it's so rational. We could also discuss a different time, to believe that the vitality, the innermost I of the person, is not a biological process, God forbid. Life is not describing the mere motion of matter, right? Rather, there is a spiritual component to life. Life is, in fact, a spiritual reality, right? And the spiritual reality that makes the Jew alive is this spiritual I am, this force that comes from the Klipa and Sitra Achra that God creates, which gives life to the body. As we're going to see, the relationship of the souls to the body is a little bit more complicated than this, because the souls are actually in war over the body, as we'll discuss later in Tanya. We haven't even got to the second soul. So the tricky part of learning the first chapter is that we're treating the Jew as if the Jew is entirely the animal soul, which in fact is not true, but we'll get to all of that. So this explanation is by definition only partial, right? But that's the basic explanation. And in fact, most of what we can live as what we might call our conscious life or our conscious awareness, most of what we know at all times is the animal soul, not the godly soul. This describes the average human experience and the average Jewish experience. And the difference between them is something we'll get into as we get further towards the end of chapter 1. We also explained last week, continuing the review, this is the third and last point we've discussed about the animal soul. We said it comes from the Klipa and Sitra Achra, which means it's a spiritual I am, a declaration of independence and separate being and reality from God. The second point we said is that it unites with the body and gives the body life by uniting with specifically with the blood in the body. It is enclosed in the body's blood. The third point we've discussed so far is that this spiritual I am is the source for all the negative character traits in the person, which we discussed last week, right? And we explained it in terms of the spiritual four elements, right? Which are not physical, but rather describe certain spiritual qualities, right? We said the spiritual quality of fire makes the person arrogant, and the spiritual quality of water is the source of all pleasures, and the spirit and like lusts and desires. And the spiritual quality of air is emptiness, right? Emptiness and empty vanity, right? And we said that the spiritual quality of earth is laziness and sadness, heaviness, right? So why? And we spent a lot of last week's class distinguishing that the Alter Rebbe is clearly using different definitions of evil as we go through this chapter. A person has to be sensitive to these different definitions, otherwise they completely miss what the Alter Rebbe is trying to say. When we say negative character traits, right, we mean negative emotionally, right? The person who is angry, it would be better morally, it would be better in terms of having a better character if he was able to control his anger. That's what we mean, right? But when we say that the Klipa and Sitra Achra is evil in the sense of it's a denial of God. We're not talking about an emotional thing or a character thing. We're talking about what we've been calling in English an existential thing, right? It's not about good behavior. A person could be a tzaddik, even as we've pointed out several times now. A person could be perfectly righteous, a perfect character, totally in control of himself, totally selfless individual, and yet he still has an animal self. He still has a biological self whose very core is separateness from the divine being, is I'm independent. That's the core of his very being. It's not a character issue. But what we are pointing out is that if it wasn't for the spiritual I am and the separation from God, then there wouldn't be the negative character traits. The negative character traits derive from the fact that there's an I am. I am separate from God is the basis for the negative character traits. Because if a person only had God is and not I am, then there is no personal goal to further. There's no personal feelings to protect or property to protect or a self to protect. All self-interest is basically lost, and therefore the emotions, which we also discussed briefly, the difference between emotions and intellect, which we'll get into much more later, the emotions which have to do with the external relations of the person, what the person for lack of better words, turns into their place of self-expression, whatever, we'll get into that more a different time. The emotions of the person fundamentally, I lost my train of thought, pardon me. I interrupted myself and then lost my own distracted myself from my own train of thought. Let's start again. The spiritual I am is the basis for, if there was no I am and there was only God is, then the emotions which serve as the person's their way of relating themselves to other things, of putting other things in their universe, and how they have they're either attached to or detached from other things that are in there, that are in the person's world. That's what emotions are, basically. There would be no reason for any of those emotions to be negative, because there is no core selfish motivation, right? So the root, and that's why we say the Alter Rebbe describes it as the four elements, right? Because the Alter Rebbe could have just said, as we discussed last week, the Alter Rebbe could have just said the animal soul is the one that has anger issues and lust issues and emptiness issues and sadness issues, right? But instead, he connects it to the four elements, right? Fire, water, air, earth. Why does he connect it to the four elements? Because the whole emphasis is that these negative character traits are not just emotional issues. Their very substance is I am, right? They're building blocks, like they're elements. What makes up the negative character traits at base is all this separation, this existential separation from God, is the fact that the neshama comes from the klipa and the sitra achra. Yes, the fact that the neshama has a separate being and a separate self from God. Okay, that's the summary ad kan. Do we have any questions before we go forward? As I take a sip of coffee. Okay, I want to read, and then I want to talk about what we read briefly, and then I want to give an introduction to the very end of chapter 1 of Tanya, which is not just sensitive, but also difficult to understand at the same time. So that's the hardest part we've had so far, but I will do my best to shepherd us through with some kind of understanding, God willing. That's the hope. Okay. We are, get my pages in order here. Okay. We are on the first line of page Vav of Tanya, which in the English is the first paragraph on page 6, which says, "From this soul stems also." We're going to read just a few lines here. Most of what's in these lines, or some of what's in these lines, we've actually learned already. We learned it out of order to make it easier to learn it. And some of this is going to be the perfect lead-in to the very end of chapter 1. So, without further ado, I'm on the top line of page Vav of the Tanya. The Alter Rebbe just said the negative character traits come from the 4 elements, ending with laziness or sloth, and sadness comes from Yesod Ha'afar, comes from page 6 and Vav, 6 in the English, Vav in the Hebrew, comes from the element of earth. Now the Alter Rebbe is continuing. V'gam midos toves shebeteva kol Yisrael, first line on page Vav. V'gam midos toves shebeteva kol Yisrael, even the positive character traits in the nature of every Jew, b'toldesam, as they have them from birth, k'may rachmanos u'gemilas chasadim, like mercy or beneficence, acts of good deeds. How does he translate? Whoa. Sorry, you're impressed with beneficence. Yes. Just checking. They say benevolence. Okay, benevolence also good. Bos mimena, also come from it. Here a plot twist, really, in a sense, a plot twist, right? So far, it's all been very orderly and relatively easy to explain. You have a soul that comes from Klippa, as we just finished reviewing. That soul, the core of it is I am, which is an existential estrangement from God, is a state of being apart from the truth, which is that all existence is divine existence. And that generates, because the person now has a self, right, and is an existence, and that existence has to be protected, defended, extended, perpetuated. Therefore, you have all of these negative character traits, right, because the I am becomes the predominant concern, and that's why you end up having all of these negative character traits. We also find out that there are positive character traits which also come from the I am, right? What positive character traits come from this I am, right? Remember, we're talking about the Jewish I am, which now for the first time we're going to see becomes a distinction from the non-Jewish I am, right? This is beginning to be why the end of chapter 1 of Tanya is so sensitive, because the end of chapter 1 of Tanya discusses a difference, a spiritual difference between Jews and non-Jews, which we are not going to shy away from. On the contrary, we are going to talk about it so much that we're going to be sick of it. That's the goal, right? Until we appreciate it, hopefully, that it's not so uncomfortable, because naturally, it's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about. But I think with the grounding, earlier in chapter 1 of Tanya, the grounding so far, we're going to see that it's really not saying something so racist. Thank you, comedians. It's not saying something so racist. It would never be, whatever. We could talk about why in the first place it would never be. That would just be a mistake to call it racist, even if you have the worst interpretation. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that shortly. Not yet. The question is, the Jewish animal soul has positive character traits that come from it, right? What are the positive character traits? It's the positive character traits. He says that in the nature of every Jew, betoldesam, which is interesting, the nature of every Jew as an inheritance, right? We are talking about national, more or less, or tribal positive character traits, which is a very interesting concept in general, which, as we're going to see, is rooted in earlier. It's not the Tanya's original innovation. This is based on a Gemara, right? But it's interesting to note that from the Gemara, you have an idea that there is such a thing as national Jewish character traits. Now, we're going to go much further and say there's a national Jewish covenantal spark of the divine, which only Jews possess in the way that they possess it. Right, the godly soul, which is literally a piece of God above, which is the center of the Jewish way of being, which they acquired through the covenant with God, starting from the patriarchs and coming all the way down, right? So we're going to be actually much more radical than saying there's just different character traits between nations, which is already today a controversial and uncomfortable thing to say. We are going to get much more uncomfortable and say that the Jew actually has an additional soul or self or point of touching with the divine, which is fundamentally different from the non-Jews. However, before we get to all of that, in order to understand that and appreciate what it actually means, it has to be done in the right way, because it's very easy. Like I said, it's not just sensitive, it's actually difficult to understand what the end of the first chapter of Tanya is saying if you work through the implications. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The national Jewish character traits, it says in the Gemara in Yevamos, right, that Jews are Rachmanin, Baishanin, Goimlei Chasadim. Jews are merciful. I don't really know exactly what these three terms mean, by the way. The translations are good, but I don't know, I haven't dug into it to really, really understand what it means. But you have merciful. Baishanin means bashful, right? And Goimlei Chasadim means literally kind unto others, right? You would say maybe in English charitable, right? Benevolent, they say here, right? That's what it says in Yevamos. Jews by nature. There's a national character trait. This is not by dint of any holiness per se exactly. This is just a national character trait. It's the way that Jews are, because they all are related to one another, and this whole family shares traits, and the traits that they share have certain emotional traits that they share, which are these three. It's interesting to note, first of all, the Alter Rebbe only brings two. Did you notice? The Alter Rebbe doesn't say baishanim, doesn't say bashful, right? Why? Because some commentaries on Tanya want to say he follows the opinion of the commentary on the Gemara. I forgot to write down who it was. One of the commentaries in the Gemara there in Yevamos explains that really it would be anyone who has any experience with Jews knows that in our experience, Jews are not baishanim. Jews are not bashful. On the contrary, Jews are loudmouthed and chutzpahdik, as you may have some notion of, and brash, not bashful, right? And in fact, the commentary on the Talmud says that is the Jewish nature, to be bashful, to be not bashful, to be chutzpahdik, stiff-necked, brash, right? What happened is that at the giving of the Torah and radiating from the giving of the Torah of Mount Sinai, that was a profoundly humbling experience, and that introduced into the Jewish nation a strain of bashfulness, which again, I don't really understand exactly what this bashfulness means, but that introduced a strain of bashfulness, but it's not the teva b'toldosam. It's not the inherited, so to speak, genetic or epigenetic, or however you want to put it, nature of the Jew. So the Alter Rebbe leaves it out, because the Alter Rebbe holds like that opinion, that it's not Jewish nature to be bashful. We had a collective experience that makes us bashful, but it's not our nature. Our nature is, in fact, exactly the opposite, which we don't need to elaborate. Everyone knows that this is the case, more or less. It's worth noting also, it's interesting to note, that in general in Chassidus, and we'll see this again in later chapters of the Tanya, so this is like just a little footnote for something much later, which is that in general in Chassidus, we don't believe that anything that comes for free is really holy. In Chassidus, the nature of holiness is that holiness is acquired with work, particularly with bittul, right? All holy things you have to work for. If you get it for free, it's not really the real deal. Now, this is a vast overgeneralization. You have to understand what this means, because there's many things which are apparently for free, which are holy, etc. But this is the general tendency, and it's interesting to note that the natural good traits that the Jew has comes from klippas nega, as we're going to say. It comes from the klipa. It's not holiness, right? In other words, a Jew may be very, very merciful by nature, But that doesn't mean they've refined their being to make it a more godly being. It's just their nature, right? So when we say, again, this is a different words for saying the same point we made in our review, which is that good character traits doesn't mean existentially good, right? There's a difference between having nicer character traits and being a more merciful person, which has nothing to do with whether the person is powerfully an I am, right? Or have they gotten rid of their I am, right? Or a different way of saying, yet a third way of saying this very simply is that there's no reason why you can't say, I am kind to others, right? The sentence begins with I am, right? But there is a certain nature in the Jewish people where that I am is more likely to be merciful to others, just as a natural, with no work whatsoever, not an accomplishment, right?
You could be merciful and immoral at the same time.
Also true, right? Overly merciful, etc. Right? Famous saying from the Midrash that those who are merciful to the wicked eventually, right? Those who are kind to the cruel eventually become cruel to the kind. That's what it says, right, in the Midrash. I believe. So now we have a mystery. The mystery is, and really, if you've been paying attention, it's really not such a mystery because we've already explained it. But how can it be that the I am also leads to positive character traits? Right? That's the mystery at the simple level. How can it be that I am leads to a positive character trait? Because I am is essentially negative, right? As we've said, separation from God, separation from the truth. And yet, I am brings with it positive character traits. And of course, you already know the answer, but we haven't said the answer in the words of the Tanya. The answer that you already know is, why does the I am bring positive character traits with it? Because the negativity of the I am is not an emotional negativity, right? It's not when we say that there's something wrong with I am, what's wrong with it is at the existential level. It's a denial of God. Where there should be a divine existence, there's a separate existence from the divine. But that says nothing about their character. It says nothing about their emotional quality, right? This is unpacked already for you. This is what the Alter Rebbe says in the following few words. The Alter Rebbe says, Ki b'Yisrael, because in Jews, noting already with bated breath that in Jews implies there's going to follow an in not Jews. In Jews, nefesh zu de klipa, this soul of klipa, he miklipas nega, comes from what's called klipas nega. Klipas nega means light. That's what the word nega means. Nega means light. Klipas nega means the shell of light. Or the more correct, a better English translation is the translucent shell, right? Transparent. It lets the light through, see-through, right? I like translucent because translucent is not quite see-through, not quite see-through. It lets light through, right? What does this mean? What does this mean? The truth is, we have already explained what this means. We're just, again, this is out of, we unpacked it earlier so we could understand what we were talking about at all, and now we're just seeing it in the words of the Alter Rebbe. What does it mean to be an I am, but to be see-through, right? So we are now going to make a fundamental distinction, which will carry us forward through the end of the first chapter of Tanya. Very important to understand that there's two different types of klippas. There's two categories. One is called klipas nega, which is what we've been discussing this whole time, which is called I am, separate existence from God. And then there's something called shalosh klipas hatameas, which means the three impure klipas, right? There'll be more on this later in Tanya. Why there's three, what the three are, doesn't even matter to us right now. There's two categories in general. Never mind that there's three or what the three correspond to. There's the translucent klipa and the three impure klipas, right? Now let's plug this back into the translation of the word, because speaking about it in Hebrew doesn't help anything, right? Klipa means I am. So klipa means. Klipa means God creates a separate being from God, a separate self from God, which says its existence is not God, right? But there's two different levels of how far you can go in being a separate being from God. The first, which we've been talking about this whole time, is I am. I am is a statement that existence is neutral. That's what I am says. I am, you are, the coffee cup is. When I say I am, it doesn't mean only I am. All I'm saying is I am. Other things could also be. This is klipas nega. This is the translucent klipa. What do we mean when it's translucent? That it lets light through? Because if existence is neutral, that means the divine existence can be a reality also. The divine existence can be a reality also. True, I'm still a klipa when I say I am. True, I'm not realizing the real truth, which is that all existence is divine. The word exist refers to God. I don't realize that because I say I am, right? But I haven't taken the concept of existence and narrowed it. All I need, in other words, to exist is a neutral concept of existence, right? That anything can be, including myself, right? I'm open. I'm open. You could say in a different language, I'm apathetic. I don't care, right? As long, in other words, existence is neutral. I'm open and neutral. Anything can exist. That's the position, right? And anything can exist means I am also, I fit in, right? Once I declare that anything can exist, I can sneak in because anything can exist, right? That's klipas nega, because the fact that I am doesn't deny that God could also be, right? And God could be in an incredible and much greater way than I am even, right? And my being could be subservient to his being, right? My being could serve his being. My being could be, to some extent, nullified within his being, even, as we'll see later in Tanya, right? Because he is also an am. He is also an is. He is also an existence, right? Just because I say I am, right, doesn't mean that God isn't. Yes? Now, you have to understand that the neutrality of klipas nega is still, relative to kedusha, relative to holiness, is still a tremendous and infinite distance. You have to understand. Because at one level, saying I am is a total denial of God. You have to understand, right? There's two levels. There's two ways of looking at it, right? Because it's in the middle. It's the middle level, right? There's the impure klipas, there's holiness, and then in the middle you have klipas nega. Klipas nega, it depends what you're looking at it relative to, right? Relative to the worst level, which we're going to discuss in a second, klipas nega is amazing, right? Because it leaves room for God to exist, and exist in an incredible way, an incredibly real way. Compared to holiness, on the other hand, klipas nega is infinitely lowly. Right? It's just another one of the klippas. Relative to holiness, all the klippas are the same, right? Because what do I care if I leave room for God to exist? The basis of all things is I am, right? Which is a denial of the truth of God, again, because God is not just another existence, right? God is the root of all existence. The word am means God. So to say I am is a rebellion against God. Yes? On the one hand. On the other hand, because it's neutral, because all I want is to get my existence, slip it in, right? That it's okay that I exist, right? And other things can exist too. It's much better than the three impure klippas. The three impure klippas are the lowest thing that God creates. Right? It's literally the termination of, in a way, below the end of existence, because the end of existence is Elam Haza, is this world. And then there's like lower than that, the lowest of all things, because they're not really real. That's why they're lower than the lowest, right? Because they're not really, it's a whole different discussion for a different, there's a whole chapter on Klippa. We'll get to that not so far from our chapter in the text of the Tanya. The lowest things are the three impure klippas. The three impure klippas don't say I am, they say only I And beyond only I am, they eventually stop having to deal with am at all, because the word is too capacious, it's too open, it's too neutral, right? At the end, they just say I. Right? Because I am means now there's room for something else to exist. That's a klippas nega mishagas, right? The lowest klippa says, ani ve'efsi ed, as the quote is, right? I am and nothing else exists. All else is not, right? You'll note in true opposition to godliness. You'll note, right? Because what's the actual truth in holiness? God says, ani ve'efsi ed, and it's true, right? I am and nothing else exists. By God, that's true. It's true. All existence is divine existence. God is the only real thing that really exists. The true opposition to God is not klippas nega, which is something exists. The true opposition to God is only I exist. But another I is saying it. Yeah, like Paray says, exactly. As Yechezkel says, and then as describes Pharaoh, that the river is mine and I made it for myself. Right? As Paray says, everything, I am the true existence. Yeah, that is like Sholosh Klippas Atameus, is the lowest Klippas. The Jewish animal soul comes from a place of neutrality, right? Comes from Klippas Nega. The Klippa is not only I exist, which, as we're going to see, would give birth to only negative character traits, an interesting relationship which is very subtle and difficult to understand. We're going to do our best to understand what that means, but we'll get to all that in a minute. The Jewish klippa is merely I am. I am is the source of all the negative emotional traits, but there's no reason it can't be the source of a positive emotional trait. Because you could say, I am depressed, or I am full of lust. Right? I am lustful. But you can also say, I am merciful, I am kindly, I am bashful, maybe even. I don't know if a Jew would say it, but you have, it depends how bashful they are, I guess. You understand the difference? The klippas nega is a position of neutrality, right? It's a position of I am, but I am could mean anything. All I want, my main concession, is that I should say I am, right? Why is klippas nega like this? Sheyesh ba gam ken tov. Klippas nega has good within it as well, as we've just pointed out, because neutrality by definition has both good and evil within it. That's what makes it neutral. It's open to all things. V'hi misoid etzadas tevera, and it derives from the esoteric secret of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which I've already explained to you in our earliest classes on Klippa, about 4 or 5 classes ago, right, where we were discussing that the eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is what brought the world of Klippas and mixed it into our world, so that now existence is on a neutral plane. It was the eating from the tree created, in a sense, objective reality, as we would call it, right? As we discussed in an earlier class. That was the act, which is the final act of creation in the Jewish story, right? Creation was not complete until after, in a sense, Adam and Eve ate from the tree. This was, in other words, this was the plan all along, not some terrible perversion of the plan. This was, in fact, the plan the whole time, that they would eat from the tree. Which is a much longer discussion, a fascinating and mysterious story, obviously, at the beginning of Bereshis, which is probably not fully comprehensible to the human mind, in all likelihood. But this was the last step, and this step, according to the Kabbalah, according to Chassidus, the Seid, as he says here, the esoteric secret of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, created objective reality, which you should now hear with your newly Tanya-fied ears. When you hear objective reality, what should you hear? You should hear klippas nega. Klippas nega, neutrality. I am, but you also are, maybe, right? I am, but maybe you also are. Objective reality, right? I'm a thing, and there's this a thing, and this a thing, and this a thing, right? Or as you might call it, if you're more poetic, the external world, right? The outer world, right? Outer in the sense of klipa, the shell, the outside world, the outsides of all things, where we're all sitting in the tank together, right? Which is not really real, it's not the truth, but it is the world of klipas nega alone. I am. Yeah. Okay, that was the part I wanted to read and explain. And you'll see there's 2 dots. And then the last few lines here are a separate little keta, separate little section known with fear and foreboding as the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. The end of chapter 1 of Tanya discusses non-Jews, discusses Gentiles, on whose behalf Jews in Tanya classes the world over are willing to be much more offended than their own behalf, naturally. It's very difficult to understand. We're going to try and take it step by step. I've sort of sketched out a class, a way we can sort of progress step to. The difficulty is that there's lots of different parts, and there's no natural order to teach them. So I've tried to order them into different points to go through so we can understand what's going on here. There's 2 points in the end of chapter 1 of Tanya about Gentiles, right? I'm going to tell them to you straight as they're said in the language of the Tanya. The Tanya says as follows. Number 1, I'm saying it like this, and I'm teaching the class like this, and I'm doing it in a humorous way because I want you to understand that for me this is also difficult to appreciate. This is not and maybe it should be. Maybe it's a good thing that it's difficult to appreciate. It's not something to take. What? It's not an easy concept. It's a challenging concept at every level. It's intellectually challenging. It's morally challenging, right? And when people learn Tanya, this is the first real challenge to, are you going to continue to learn Tanya? It's almost like the Alter Rebbe put it there on purpose, right? To see whether you'll make it to chapter 2, right? After reading the end of chapter 1. Although in the times of Alter Rebbe, I have a sense it was not so difficult for the Jews then as it is for us now. But we haven't got to that yet. We're going to talk about all of that. And there's a famous story of the Alter Rebbe about the end of the chapter 1 of Tanya. We're going to get to all of that. The end of chapter 1 of Tanya says 2 things. Number 1, it says the souls of Gentiles are from, there were versions of the Tanya which said idolaters, but they were specifically corrected by the Alter Rebbe and the other Rebbes to not say idolaters, but to say non-Jews in general. So the correct girsa is Gentiles in general, not idolaters, right? It is going to say umas ha'elam, right? Not akum, not ovdei kachav mazalos. It's going to say umas ha'elam, right? The souls of the nations of the world, of Gentiles, of non-Jews, come from the shalosh klipas hatameis. They come from, the first point is, they come from the 3 impure klipas. I'm not reading, by the way. I'm just... Yeah, it's funny, right? It's not non-correct. It's earlier prints. Interesting, right? So we have a girsa clash, right? But as far as I'm aware, this is the correct girsa. The correct girsa in the Tanya, the correct wording of the Tanya, the uncensored version is not idolaters, but all Gentiles, as we're going to explain. There's a reason why it makes sense to say idolaters as well. We're going to get into all of this, right? The souls of non-Jews are from the Shalosh Klipas HaTameis, right? In other words, the animal soul of the Jew, as we've been discussing, is from Klipas Nega, is from the place of neutrality. The souls of non-Jews, on the other hand, and they only have more or less one, we'll discuss that as well. They don't have the second soul, which is discussed in the 2nd chapter of Tanya, right? But that also is not as simple as it seems. The souls of non-Jews are from the klippas that actively deny God. In other words, they are from an existentially worse place. They're from an existentially lower place. Their soul comes from a place that says not just I am, but in a sense, only I am, no room for God. Number 2, as we are going to say, that that is the reason why the Gentiles or the nations have no good in them at all, a direct quote, right? As it says in the Eitz Chaim, all good they do is for themselves, number 1. And number 2, It says in the Gemara, the kindness of the nations is sin, and they only do kindness for self-aggrandizement, right? For their own lehisyaher. How would you translate lehityaher?
Schwitz.
What?
To schwitz.
No.
Yeah, schwitz might be to show off.
Yeah, to show off. There we go. Self-aggrandizement, as I said. Is that the same thing?
Never heard this word.
It's just English and Hebrew. It's the difference. Yeah, that's what the Tanya says. Difficult to wrap your head around. It's difficult to wrap your head around for a number of reasons. The first thing to point out, first of all, is that there's a couple of preliminary things before we even start getting into this. My goal is that for the rest of the class tonight, we'll just sort of introduce it, and then next week we'll have the full class on the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. Yeah. The first thing to point out is that the Alter Rebbe is quoting almost verbatim both the Eitz Chaim, which is Kabbalah from the Arizal, right, and the Gemara. So in other words, these are not, the concept, especially in its simple reading, is not original to the Tanya. In other words, this is the Alter Rebbe is bringing them out to support his point about the souls of the Gentiles coming from the Shorosh Klippos HaTameis. But the Alter Rebbe is not the originator of the strongest language here. Gentiles have no good in them whatsoever, for example, comes from previous sources. The second point is that, which feels like a bit of a silly point, but since it was brought up tonight, I feel like it's worth pointing out anyway, is that this is not what you would call racism. Even on the worst reading, right, which we're going to see, is not as simple as it first appears here. Even from the teachings of the Rebbeim, in fact, even based on the teachings of the Tzemach Tzedek, the contemporaries of the Alter Rebbe, this was already seen to be a much more complex issue than it's first painted as. And the Alter Rebbe is writing it this way to bring out a contrast rather than to paint a full picture of all of reality, etc., whatever, as we're going to see. Even on the worst reading, where you just say, oh, great, the Gentiles are all purely evil, which doesn't make any sense, by the way. Even according to Torah and Halacha, it doesn't make any sense. But even if you were to read it that way and say, oh, they're all just evil, there's no real good in them whatsoever, right? It still wouldn't be racist for the simple reason that one can convert to Judaism at the most basic level. Right? In other words, this isn't a fixed trait. This is a contingent trait.
So it's patronizing. So.
Oh, it's definitely patronizing. I'm just pointing out, it's important. It's important. I'll bring it up because some people will have that knee-jerk reaction. It's important to keep in mind, we're not talking about an inherent trait. Even at the simplest reading, it's much more complicated than this. But we're not talking about an inherent trait, right? If someone really cared, in other words, right, they could convert to Judaism, at least in theory, right? So in other words, it's not like a person is stuck in the category of being not Jewish just by dint of where they were born. It's not a caste system. It's not racism in the traditional definition, right? I feel it's important for the contemporary audience of these classes, this is an important point to point out. But as we're going to see, we really don't even need this semi-silly point, because as we're going to see, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is not the worst reading possible. In fact, the Alter Rebbe cannot be saying that reading, as we're going to see. We were discussing earlier the three impure klippos. The three impure klippos, the klippos nega is I am. The Jewish animal soul is I am. It's translucent. It allows God to exist as well. It lets the light in. The three impure klippos are a lower form of evil. Which type of evil? Existential evil, right? Which deny God even further. They say, only I am. Right? With me so far? In what sense do the three klippos, this is the starting point, I think, for this conversation. In what sense do the three impure klippos have no good in them at all? And the Alter Rebbe is going to say, we haven't read it inside yet, the Alter Rebbe is going to say, because the animal soul, because the soul of a Gentile comes from the three impure klippas, it doesn't have any good in it whatsoever, right? And then he begins to discuss emotional traits, right? But as we have already seen from the first part of Tanya, there's a distinction between the evil of the klippa versus kedusha spectrum, of the denial of God versus the acknowledgement of God existentially. That's a different story, right? Versus emotional traits. So before, assuming that this parallels the discussion earlier of Jewish emotional traits, where the entire emphasis was because of the nature of the I am, it produces these positive and negative emotional traits, right? So, in parallel, by the non-Jew, the Alter Rebbe is saying the same thing. You have the emotional traits, the behavioral side that you could judge from the outside, and that derives from the spiritual source, right? The spiritual, not just what do you do and how do you behave and how do you feel, but what are you, right? The answer of what are you for the Jew, says the Alter Rebbe, is I am. And that produces both positive and negative. Good and bad things come out of it, right? The root of the non-Jew, the Alter Rebbe is saying, is only I am. And only negative traits come out of it, right? But what do we mean when we say there's no good in only I am at all?
It doesn't come from Etzatat to Barat. It means there's no free choice, actually.
No, I don't think so. I'm not sure if that's correct. You're right in that it doesn't come from Etzadas Tevera. It's not about the mixture of good and evil. Leave free choice out of it. That's like 12 classes by itself. Leave that out of it. But you're right. It doesn't come from the mixture of good and evil. But what I'm saying is, let me make the question clearer that I'm asking. Can anything be without good at all?
No.
When I say good, I mean in the sense of klippa versus kedusha, denial of God versus acknowledgement of God. Right? The truth that all existence is divine versus the concealment and estrangement from that truth, which is to say, I am, or only I, or whatever, all of these different levels, right? So if you say that evil is the denial of the truth, right? And good is the extension of the truth, that only God is there anything without any good in it whatsoever? Is the first step. Why not?
Because even the bad comes from God. You cannot the whole life. Still comes from God.
Say better. Why can't a bad thing come from God? God can create anything he wants.
It says,
from this class, from what we've spoken about today, I'm not asking you something you don't know. I'm asking you something you know. That's why I'm asking you.
Okay.
From the class today, we've explained this. Why can anything be totally bad in this sense? Because all existence is divine existence. If it exists, right? If it exists, what? Is that what you're trying to say? But the fact is, it's not the idea, there's subtlety. It's not because God doesn't create evil. That's just saying as a gezerah, so to speak, as decree, God doesn't create evil. Based on what we've been discussing, if to exist, the existence must be a divine existence, must be godly, right? Then the fact that the Shalosh Klipos HaTameis exist, the fact that you have that Pharaoh exists, for example, that Haman exists, that Antiochus exists, for example, right? The fact that they exist means they have good in them, right? Good in the sense of all existence is divine existence. So what then do we mean when we say they don't have any good in them at all, right? You'll immediately see that it must immediately be qualified, right? And it's not what you would call a pshetel. We're not. You know what the word pshetel is? English word. It's a Yiddish word. A pshetel a pshetel is when the simple reading makes you uncomfortable, so you try and to twist it, make it nicer, right? This is not a pshetel. This is based on the Alter Rebbe's whole system and way of looking at the world, right? We're not. In other words, we're not. All the qualifications we're making are qualifications only in the sense of we read it with a totally uneducated perspective. I want you to understand the difference. I'll tell you a famous story. That'll explain the difference. About pshetlach, right? A pshetel is when you like read into it, right? Like if you tell someone who only understands the Chumash like at the level of a 5-year-old, which is unfortunately millions of people on planet Earth, but if you tell someone who only reads Chumash like a 5-year-old, when it says God takes the Jews out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, God doesn't actually have an arm, right? It's a metaphor. It's not. God doesn't actually have a like this. Yeah. That person could then tell you pshetlach, right? You're reading into you don't like the idea that God has an arm. The verse says he has an arm. Right? What's such a person called? Such a person is called an idiot. That's the word for such a person, right? Because the only reason they assume, the only reason the simple reading is the way that it is in their head is because they don't know anything. If they knew anything, they would know that even the simple reading is not the literal reading in the sense that they think it is, right? I'll give you a story to illustrate, right? This was a story that was told to me in yeshiva, which I think about all the time. It's one of the gems that I learned in yeshiva. Once upon a time, there was a city in Latvia called Dvinsk. Dvinsk had, at one point in the early 20th century, the late 19th and early 20th century, late 1800s, early 1900s, Dvinsk had 2 rabbis. Naturally, right? Because you need the shul that you go to and the shul you would never step foot in, right? So the Hasidim had 1 rabbi, and the opponents to the Hasidim had a different rabbi. The name of the Hasidic rabbi was called the Rogachover Gaon, right? The Gaon of Rogachev, who the Rebbe knew and had correspondence with, etc. Some people say I gave the Rebbe Smicha. I don't know about that. You can go Google the controversy, thousands of forum pages, whatever, it doesn't matter. Then you had the other rabbi who was called the Or Sameach, who you also probably have heard of. Right? You may know the Or Sameach is a yeshiva. The yeshiva is named after a rabbi who was the rabbi of Dvinsk. You wrote a sefer called Or Sameach, right? I think it's named after him anyway, the yeshiva. But the Or Sameach was the non-Hasidic rabbi in Dvinsk. And I have news for you: the more approachable and friendlier rabbi was the Or Sameach. The Rogachover was not known for his openness, friendliness, social graces, his big heart for communitarian work. Right, he was a genius of geniuses, but that doesn't mean he was interested in talking to the bubba with the booby with her chicken to tell her whether it's kosher or not. Doesn't necessarily mean he was so interested always. The more approachable rabbi, even for the Hasidim, they had tremendous respect for each other. By the way, this was a place of peace. There was no fight here, right? This was a place that they had respect for one another, and very often even the Hasidim would go to the Or Sameach because you're less likely to get your head bitten off. So they say, to put it coarsely. But that's not the story. I'm right at the end of class. I'm taking all your time. I'm not telling you the story. The story is the Rogachover Gaon was a very short man physically. Or Sameach was very tall and thin. The Rogachover was small. He was small and stout, right? There's pictures of him. So one was very tall and thin, and one was very short. After davening one morning in Dvinsk, they finished Shachris, and then they started drinking branfen and eating herring, as one does, as what you're supposed to do after Shachris, right? And the men in the shul are discussing who's greater, the Or Sameach, the Rogachover. Oh, and they're throwing arguments back and forth, and as only Jews can because of their great bashfulness, right? The Jews are so bashful; they're arguing with each other and shouting at one another. And no, what do you know? I know this story from the Rogachover. Oh, what do you know? The Or Sameach. They're fighting with each other. Who's greater? A small child, a small boy, 7 years old, walks into the shul and he listens to this fighting and he starts to laugh, and he's laughing uproariously. So the men say, Yingle, lad, what's so funny? And he says, you fools, anyone who's walked in the market of Dvinsk knows that the Or Sameach is greater and the Rogachover is less great. The Or Sameach is very tall, right? The Rogachover, not so much. It's arguing over. It's obvious, the Or Sameach is greater. So they tell him, fool, young child, you don't understand. We're not talking about who's greater and how tall they are. We're talking about their spiritual qualities and their learnedness and what they give to world Jewry and our community and Torah and their learning and the whole thing. Who cares how tall they are? There's no connection. There's no discussion. The child tells them, don't give me your pshat. Don't like try and twist what the word greatness means. I know what the word greatness means, right? It's the taller one. Yeah, that's the story about Pshetlach, right? In other words, why is this connected to Tanya? Because as we're going to see in next week's class, God willing, as we get into this and go through the whole thing, the way we are going to explain this fundamentally, the core of the explanation involves a few pieces. One of the pieces is that not all Gentiles are the Gentiles that the Alter Rebbe is discussing. There's an intermediate level called the Chassidei Umas Ha'elam, which are called the kindness, the righteous among the nations, as they translate it, which are an incredibly vast number of non-Jews today, in all likelihood, right? Who are not in this category. The righteous among the nations are not all from the Shosh Klipos Tameis, they're from the Klipos Nega, they're just like the Jewish soul. We're going to discuss how that can be and what that means, that there are gradations among the nations of the world in the very nature of their soul, right? Which is very strange because it's not with a conversion, it's with a change of mindset, right? It's not like they convert to being Chassidei Umas Ha'elam. They have a different way of looking at the world, which can be very subtly different. And all of a sudden, we say they have a totally different soul, which is the Alter Rebbe's position. And we're going to explain why that is and what that means, right? But all of this, and therefore, what the Alter Rebbe is saying, and we're going to reread and go into what the Alter Rebbe is saying based on the Gemara, etc., and explain how this whole perspective of there being only wickedness among the nations is very logical if you're talking about the non-righteous among the nations, if you're talking about the idolaters among the nations, right? We're going to discuss what an idolater is and why an idolater has no true good in them at all and what that means, right? All of this is not trying to read Pshetlach into an uncomfortable Pshat of the Alter Rebbe. On the contrary, this is the Pshat of the Alter Rebbe. This is the simple reading of the Alter Rebbe. The reason we read it as so uncomfortable and not knowing what it means is because we don't know anything, right? So what we're going to explain next week, the rest of the story, how to understand the end of the first chapter of Tanya, is not reading something in, right? If we thought like that, we would be like the child who says that they can say greatness means whatever they want, but I know the tall one is greater, right? On the contrary, knowing the Alter Rebbe's whole system and his whole way of looking at the world, you'll see that the end of chapter 1 of Tanya, and we've really, in a sense, all of our classes so far on Tanya have prepared us to understand this well, that it all comes together at the end here. You'll see that this is in fact what the Alter Rebbe intends, and the entire point of the end of the first chapter of Tanya is to help you understand what we mean by Klipas Nega, right? The Jew's soul, because you could ask, why even talk about non-Jews, right? In Tanya, it's not a book for non-Jews, it's a book for Jews, right? The entire point is to understand the distinction between Shalosh Klipas HaTmeis and Klipas Nega, between one type of Klipa and another type of Klipa, because as we're going to see, the fact that the animal soul is of Klipas Nega is of one of, you could say, the facts of absolute paramount importance in Tanya. It's one of the most important facts in the entire Tanya, that the Jewish animal soul comes from Klipas Nega. Because as we're going to see, because Klipas Nega is existentially neutral, that means you can use it for good as well. And in fact, that's the reason we're all here. That's the whole point of everything, is the transformation of the animal soul. So God willing, next week we'll use our full time and explain the end of the first chapter of Tanya.